consuming RESTful web services that have RAML definitions. Now, we talked a lot about RAML in class. What if a service we were calling out to had an existing RAML available for it? Well, we can use that in our HTTP requester. We just need to provide a RAML location, whether that's out on the web or local to our project. And we can, after specifying that RAML location, have the fields automatically populated. Based on the RAML, it will know what's going out and what's coming in for that request. RAML metadata. This metadata will be maintained, or obtained rather, every time you open the project in Anypoint Studio. It's kept in a cache until you close the project out and can be refreshed and reloaded if that RAML were to change. It's used by Anypoint Studio to offer you intelligent suggestions like you can see in the bottom here, where it knows all the different URI types you might wish to call. And that's our next walkthrough, 7.3. Consume a RESTful web service that has a RAML definition. In this example, we'll create a new flow to call a RESTful web service that has a RAML definition. We'll select the web service resource from the list provided by Anypoint Studio from the RAML file, and we'll use DataWeave to transform that JSON response into the JSON we specified in our API. Let's get started. For this next example, we're going to get a URL we used in a previous module. So take a moment, you may need to pause this video, to go to anypoint.mulesoft.com and find that old URL from earlier where you had your name at the end, but at the beginning, American-flights-API. You might recall that we had the web service, kind of the implementation layer, and then the API layer on top that was enforcing the client ID and secret. So find what name you had deployed to in Cloud Hub earlier, and go ahead and copy that name to your clipboard if you don't have it already. Back inside of Postman, we're going to paste this URL in, and do be sure to add .cloudhub.io if it's not already there. We'll send a quick request in, and it's likely that we'll be told that it is an invalid client ID for this message. So, to get that client ID and secret again, you may still have it in your student files. Otherwise, you'll need to look it up through the API manager. In your student files, under the snippets directory, you might recall that we put our client ID and client secret inside of here. So I'm going to grab the client ID, in this case for Max Mule. Once again, we'll have client ID equals that. And then same thing for client secret. And as you're putting this in, if you see it show up in Postman in the history as an autocomplete item, feel free to use that, of course, if it'll save you some time. Okay, and I'll put my secret in here as well. And hit send. All right. So at least I'm authenticating this time. On top of calling this address, we also need to make sure we are on the path of flights. So I've added /flights in between the first query param and the host. We'll hit send again. And there we go. We've got some flight data coming back to us. Now, this API does have a RAML file backing it. So let's see if we can use this RAML file. We'll go back to Anypoint Studio, specifically in our implementation XML, and let's start a second flow inside of here. In the palette, we'll drag a second HTTP connector into the canvas. All right, we'll double click on this listener, and this specific listener, let's be sure it's using the same connector config, but this time is listening in on the American endpoint to represent American flights. And for the allowed methods, we'll set it as GET. Similar to our flow above, let's also bring an HTTP requester into the process phase. We'll start by right-clicking and renaming that HTTP requester and call it American REST request, and hit enter to set the doc name. That way we know what it is a bit later. All right, now we need this requester to be set up. There's a couple places that we can do it at. Let's go to the global XML and see if we can set the requester up there. So we'll go to our global XML, hop into that global elements tab, and then create once again. This is going to be a request configuration that we'd like to create. So let's select that. And this time it will be a slightly different endpoint than our previous endpoint. In this specific case, we are going to bring in a RAML file and see if it can infer a lot of these different pieces for us. So once we've hit create, let's go over to our RAML location area here, and let's hit search RAML in Exchange. From the search RAML in Exchange box, if you're not already logged in, take a moment to click login inside of here. And we'll take a moment to log in. And once logged in, let's look for our American RAML file. So I'll search for American, see the American RAML inside of here, and click open. And now that everything is parsed up, we should see the host, port, and base path resolved. You will notice we're going to just call the web service, the implementation layer, if you will, layer directly, just for convenience sake. Typically, we'd be calling the proxy layer that was higher up, as we had discussed in an earlier module. Let's also be sure, if you haven't already, just be 100% sure you've got American HTTP request config. You're going to want to be able to discern between United and American easily in just a moment here. Let's hit OK to this configuration box, save up the global XML, and then head back to our implementation XML, where we will select our American REST request and start off by ensuring that it references the American request configuration, in which we can now drop down the path box, and we're going to see some options that it infers from the RAML, flights and flights ID. Let's choose flights flight ID inside of here. And for the method in this case, if we drop these down, you'll notice it also gives us a targeted list of what it knows from the RAML. Let's choose get in this case. And in this first example, we'll actually choose from our path the flights box inside of here. Primarily wanted to show you the couple of options that flight ID had over flights, but we'll make sure we have just flights and get inside. All right, now if we scroll down a little bit inside of here, we can see that the URI parameter box is set. Let's actually drop this down and set this to a query parameter. The name of our query parameter is going to be code, and the value of this query parameter will once again be the flow vars we set up earlier, .code. Now this time you'll notice it won't autocomplete. This flow doesn't have access to that variable just yet. We'll fix that in a moment, but just something to be aware of. Now, let's see if we can restructure this app in such a way that we can reuse that variable setter. So what we'll start off by doing is selecting our variable inside of here. Let's right click and rename it. Give it a name of set airport code variable. All right. And now inside of this flow, we're going to right click and extract this to its own subflow so it has its own little unit. We'll click subflow here and we'll title this subflow set code subflow and hit OK. Now the flow reference it puts in place, we do want to select it and make sure that the display name changes itself already. And when we click out, we should see it update. Otherwise, update it manually. We want to make sure it does represent what it's calling. Below this, inside of the implementation section, we of course want to do something very similar. So let's put a flow reference in there as well. And from the flow reference that we drop in, let's call set code subflow from here. Select that and make sure that it is chosen inside of here. All right. Now that we've got this in place, we can save it up, and let's test out our application and see what happens. So we will save the app, and if it's already running, it should at this point restart for us. We'll go back to Postman, and inside of Postman with our local host calls, we now should have a new endpoint we can call, which is American. And inside of here, we should be able to specify something like SFO as a query parameter. So let's try this out. If we hit send, that request will go out, and as you scroll through, you'll just see SFO flights coming back from our web service. If we go inside of here and choose LAX and hit send, now for the American flights, we'll just see the LAX results inside of here as well. So looking pretty good. We're now calling our own web service driven by that RAML file. Now let's return to Anypoint Studio, and let's do some transformation again to make these these outputs from JSON's perspective consistent. So we'll go in here and we'll add a transformer to the implementation flow down here at the bottom. In fact, before we go any further, you'll notice how I just called that implementation flow. It'd be wise to rename this as well. That way we know exactly what this flow does throughout class. So let's take a moment to do that as well. We'll rename this and call it Get American Flights Flow. Okay, that'll make sure that we can identify that a bit easier. All right, and now back to transform message. Now, I had dragged transform message in between these two, and if you think about what we want to do, it's not necessarily the correct place. We want to still get the response back and then transform it, make it that canonical JSON structure before going to our client. So let's make sure that transform message is to the right of our American REST request. And if you double click on transform message, you'll notice something pretty cool happens. It infers, because of the RAML, exactly what the metadata is coming out of that JSON response. So we've got half of the equation done for us with the metadata. Now if we go to define metadata on the right, we can simply choose our flights JSON we had set before or used before, and we can reuse that metadata inside of our output choice here as well. So this way we can kind of canonicalize, and let's see if we can set this up. I want to bring the structure to the left into its respective fields on the right. Let's go ahead and test this out. We'll start off by trying to bring ID over, or code rather. So I'll bring code over to flight code. Okay, we'll bring price over to price, and again, continuing with what's consistent here, departure date to departure date. Origin on the left will once again be from, destination will be to. Empty seats inside of here will be the empty seats option. Now inside of the plain box here, you've got the type and the total seats. So type will go to the plain type field, while total seats will go to the total seats field inside of here. If we double click on the airline field inside of here, you'll notice it sets a little value of null. Now this will always be American, so let's go ahead and put in a string literal of American inside of here. When the data structure gets printed out, it will always contain that. Great, so now we've potentially canonicalized the structure as well with the flow we have right above for United. Let's go ahead and save this up as well. If your runtime is running, of course it will restart as we know. And we should now be able to go into Postman. And my hope is we're going to see a structure that's very consistent with our United structure. So let's hit send once again for an American request. We now see a structure that hopefully looks a bit familiar, this time of course for American. And as a little refresher, if we go back to our history and call one of the United requests again, you'll see how that structure is identical. Aside from the data inside of it, we're producing the same JSON out. And this will be quite important to us a bit later in class. All right, so now we've called a REST service just primarily through specifying URI parameters and also through a RAML definition. Let's hop back and take a look at some other web service details.